There are sounds that haunt the human soul long after the battle has ended. During World War II, certain noises became synonymous with death, destruction, and the deepest psychological terror imaginable. These weren't just mechanical sounds. They were psychological weapons that could break a soldier's spirit before the first shot was fired. Tonight, we journey through the 7 most terrifying sounds that echoed across the battlefields between 1939 and 1945. Each one tells a story of human ingenuity turned toward the darkest purposes, where sound itself became a weapon of war. Our journey begins with a sound that Allied soldiers dubbed the Mini Mona, a chilling nickname that barely captured the psychological impact of Germany's Panzerwerfer rocket launcher. Introduced in April 1943, the Panzerwerfer was Germany's answer to the Soviet Katyusha, but with a distinctly German engineering approach. This self-propelled rocket launcher was mounted on a modified Maltier half-track, creating a mobile platform of terror that could appear anywhere along the front lines. What made the Panzerwerfer particularly unnerving wasn't just its destructive power, it was the sound. Unlike conventional artillery that fired single shells with distinct reports, the Panzerwerfer unleashed salvos of 10 rockets in rapid succession. Each rocket motor produced a distinctive howling noise as it streaked toward its target, creating a chorus of mechanical screams that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Allied soldiers described the sound as otherworldly, like the wailing of mechanical banshees announcing imminent doom. The rockets themselves were relatively inaccurate compared to traditional artillery, but that was precisely the point. They weren't designed for precision. They were designed to carpet an area with explosive terror, and the sound alone could scatter enemy formations before the first rocket even landed. Weighing 7.1 tons and measuring 6 meters in length, the Panzerwerfer could reach speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour, allowing German forces to fire devastating barrages and then quickly relocate before counter-battery fire could reach them. Some variants even mounted defensive machine guns above the cab, turning these rocket platforms into formidable multi-role combat vehicles. Soviet forces, who faced the brunt of Panzerwerfer attacks on the Eastern Front, reported that the sound alone could cause experienced veterans to seek cover, their nerves shattered by the mechanical symphony of approaching destruction. Moving up our scale of psychological terror, we encounter the Soviet Union's most feared artillery weapon, the Katyusha rocket launcher, known to German soldiers as Stalin's organ. The nickname wasn't born from respect, but from pure, visceral fear. When a battery of Katyusha launchers opened fire simultaneously, the sound resembled a massive, demonic pipe organ played by the god of war himself. Each rocket produced a distinctive whistling scream as it arced through the sky. But when dozens fired together, the individual screams merged into something far more terrifying. First deployed in July 1941 during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Katyusha system was revolutionary in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. Mounted initially on ordinary trucks, later predominantly on American-supplied Studebakers, each launcher could fire 16 M13 rockets in less than 10 seconds. German soldiers on the receiving end of Katyusha attacks described the experience as nightmarish. The sound began as distant whistling, growing louder and more intense until it became an ear-splitting shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Unlike artillery shells that followed predictable ballistic trajectories, Katyusha rockets seemed to dance through the sky, their unpredictable flight paths adding an element of randomness to the terror. The psychological impact was so severe that German forces developed specific tactical responses, not just to the weapons themselves, but to their sound. Veterans learned to distinguish between different rocket types by their audio signatures, using the precious seconds of flight time to find whatever cover they could. Each M13 rocket carried a 5-kilogram high-explosive warhead and had a range of up to 8.5 kilometers. But it wasn't the individual destructive power that made Katyushas so feared. It was their ability to saturate an entire area with explosive death in a matter of seconds. A single battery could deliver 4.35 tons of explosives onto a target area faster than any conventional artillery system of the time. In the middle of our terror scale sits perhaps the most distinctive sound of infantry combat in World War II. The rapid-fire chatter of Germany's MG-42 machine gun, universally known as Hitler's Buzzsaw. The nickname perfectly captured the weapon's most terrifying characteristic, its incredibly high rate of fire. While most machine guns of the era fired between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, the MG-42 unleashed an average of 1,200 rounds per minute, some variants reaching as high as 2,500. This wasn't just a mechanical achievement. It was a psychological weapon that could break enemy morale through sound alone. Allied soldiers described the MG-42's sound as unlike anything they had ever heard. American troops, accustomed to their own M1919 Browning machine guns with their distinctive rhythmic chug, 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 were completely unprepared for the MG-42's continuous buzz. The sound was so alien and intimidating that the US military produced special training films to accustom their troops to the weapon's audio signature. British soldiers developed their own nickname for the weapon, the Ripper, inspired by the tearing sound the bullets made as they passed through the air at such high velocity. Soviet forces called it the Linoleum Ripper, referring to the characteristic ripping sound that preceded the arrival of 7.92mm Mauser rounds at lethal velocity. The MG-42's psychological impact extended far beyond its rate of fire. The weapon was designed to be operated without a single shot mode. It could only fire in fully automatic bursts. This meant that any engagement with an MG-42 position involved facing continuous, overwhelming firepower that could sweep across entire fields of battle in seconds. German tactics maximized the weapon's psychological impact by positioning MG-42s to create overlapping fields of fire. Allied soldiers advancing across open ground would suddenly find themselves caught in a web of buzzing death, with multiple machine guns creating a soundscape of mechanical terror that seemed impossible to escape.
That high rate of fire, it eats up ammunition.
The weapon's reliability was legendary. It could fire continuously for extended periods without jamming, meaning that once the buzzing began, soldiers knew it could continue indefinitely. This reliability, combined with a distinctive sound signature, made the MG-42 one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal. As we climb higher on our scale of psychological terror, we encounter a sound that struck fear into the hearts of both soldiers and civilians. The distinctive grinding, clanking rhythm of German Panzer tank tracks approaching through the battlefield. The sound was unmistakable and unavoidable. Unlike wheeled vehicles that could move with relative stealth, the massive steel tracks of German tanks announced their presence from kilometers away. The grinding of metal on metal, combined with the deep rumble of powerful engines, created a mechanical symphony that signaled the approach of nearly unstoppable armored death. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were not just vehicles, they were mobile fortresses that redefined battlefield dynamics. The Panzer V Panther, weighing 45 tons, and the legendary Panzer VI Tiger, weighing a massive 57 tons, didn't just move across the battlefield, they dominated it with their very presence. Allied tank crews developed an almost supernatural ability to identify different German tanks by sound alone. The Tiger tank's distinctive transmission whine, combined with its track signature, could be identified from incredible distances. Veteran Sherman tank commanders could distinguish between a Tiger, Panther, or Panzer IV, purely by the acoustic signature of their approach. The psychological impact was devastating. Allied infantry, already struggling with inadequate anti-tank weapons, would hear the approaching sound of Panzer tracks and know that their position was about to become untenable. The sound triggered an immediate fight-or-flight response, and more often than not, flight was the only viable option. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front developed particular fear of the Tiger tank's sound signature. The combination of the Maybach V12 engine and the distinctive track pattern created what they called the sound of the Iron Devil. Red Army soldiers reported that the mere sound of an approaching Tiger could cause entire units to abandon their positions, even when they were equipped with anti-tank weapons. The tracks themselves were engineering marvels designed for maximum intimidation as much as functionality. The wide steel pads distributed the tank's enormous weight, while creating the characteristic grinding sound that became synonymous with German armored supremacy. On hard surfaces like city streets, the sound would echo between buildings, making it seem as if an entire armored division was approaching when it might be just a single tank. Moving into the upper echelons of psychological terror, we encounter one of the most insidious sounds of World War II. The distinctive pulse jet engine of Germany's V-1 flying bomb, followed by something even more terrifying: complete silence. The V-1, known by various nicknames including Doodlebug, Buzz Bomb, and Flying Bomb, was Germany's first operational cruise missile. But it wasn't just its explosive payload that made it so terrifying. It was the psychological warfare embedded in its very design. The sound began as a distant puttering, like a motorcycle struggling with a faulty engine. As it grew closer, the pulse jet's characteristic rhythm became unmistakable, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to destruction. Londoners during the Blitz learned to recognize this sound with deadly accuracy, knowing they had only minutes to find shelter. But the truly insidious element of the V-1's psychological warfare wasn't the noise. It was what happened when the noise stopped. The flying bomb was designed to cut its engine when it reached its target area, beginning a silent glide toward impact. This created the most psychologically devastating weapon sequence imaginable. The building tension of the approaching engine noise, followed by sudden, absolute silence that meant death was now falling from the sky. Londoners developed a grim saying during the V1 campaign: "When you can hear it, you're safe. When you can't hear it, pray." The silence that followed the engine cutoff lasted anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds, enough time for people to hold their breath and wonder if they were about to die. The V1 campaign began in June 1944, just 1 week after D-Day, as Germany's desperate attempt to break British morale and divert Allied resources from the Normandy invasion. Over the following months, more than 9,500 V1s were launched against Britain, with nearly 2,500 reaching London. The psychological impact was so severe that the British government launched an unprecedented defense campaign. Fighter pilots learned to intercept the flying bombs, either shooting them down or using their wingtips to tip the V1s off course. Anti-aircraft batteries created protective curtains of fire, and barrage balloons formed aerial obstacles. But nothing could eliminate the fundamental terror of that distinctive engine sound, followed by deadly silence. Each V1 carried a 1,170-pound warhead and flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. They were visible during daylight hours, appearing as small, stub-winged aircraft with flames shooting from their tail-mounted pulse jet engines. But seeing them didn't reduce their psychological impact. If anything, it made the experience worse, as people could watch their potential death approaching in slow motion. Near the pinnacle of psychological terror stands one of the most recognizable and feared sounds in military history: the piercing wail of the Junkers Ju-87 Stukas dive bomber siren, officially known as the Jericho Trumpet. No sound in World War II was more carefully engineered for psychological warfare than the Stuka's siren. The Jericho Trumpet wasn't an accidental byproduct of the aircraft's design. It was a deliberate weapon, as much a part of the Stuka's armament as its bombs and machine guns. The siren system, officially called the Jericho Trumpet, consisted of wind-driven sirens mounted on the aircraft's fixed landing gear. As the Stuka entered its characteristic near-vertical dive toward the target, air rushing past these sirens created a rising, penetrating wail that could be heard from miles away. The sound started as a distant moan and built to an ear-splitting shriek that seemed to tear through the very air itself. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers and civilians alike described the sound as otherworldly, like the screaming of demons diving from hell itself. The rising pitch of the siren corresponded directly to the Stuka's increasing dive speed, creating an auditory countdown to destruction that built tension to an almost unbearable level. German propaganda recognized the power of this sound and used it extensively in newsreels and radio broadcasts. The distinctive wail became synonymous with German air power and the seemingly unstoppable advance of the Wehrmacht during the early years of the war. For many people across Europe, the Jericho Trumpet was the first and last sound of German invasion. The Stuka's effectiveness in the early war period was remarkable. During the invasion of Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, Stukas spearheaded the German blitzkrieg tactics, providing precise close air support that helped German ground forces achieve unprecedented advances. The psychological impact of the siren often scattered enemy forces before the bombs even fell. However, The siren's effectiveness was also its weakness. As the war progressed and Allied forces became accustomed to the sound, it began to serve as an early warning system rather than a psychological weapon. Experienced soldiers learned to use the distinctive wail to track incoming attacks and take appropriate cover. The sirens also created an unexpected problem for German aircrew. The constant, ear-splitting noise during multiple combat missions proved so psychologically damaging to Stuka pilots and gunners that many units eventually removed the sirens entirely to preserve their crew's sanity and hearing. At the absolute pinnacle of our scale of psychological terror stands not a single sound, but a horrifying symphony that combined every element of aerial warfare into one overwhelming assault on human senses and sanity: the strategic bombing raid. It began with the sirens. Not one or two, but dozens, then hundreds of air raid sirens wailing across entire cities simultaneously. The sound created a wave of mechanical anguish that rolled across the urban landscape, warning millions of civilians that death was approaching from the sky. But the sirens were just the overture to a symphony of terror that would build over the following hours. Next came the sound that made hearts stop and blood run cold: the deep, rhythmic drone of hundreds of aircraft engines approaching in formation. During the London Blitz, Londoners would hear the approaching formations long before they became visible. The sound started as a distant humming, like a massive swarm of mechanical insects. As the formations drew closer, the drone became deeper, more rhythmic, and seemingly endless. People could feel the sound as much as hear it, a bass note that resonated in their chests and seemed to shake the very foundations of their world. The Luftwaffe's bombing formations during the Blitz often consisted of 200 to 400 aircraft approaching in waves. Each aircraft's engines contributed to a collective drone that witnesses described as the sound of approaching doom itself. The formation flying created a rhythmic beating effect as hundreds of engines synchronized and desynchronized, creating an audio signature that was absolutely unmistakable. Then came the bombs themselves. Between the explosions came other sounds that added to the psychological horror. The crack and crash of buildings collapsing, the roar of fire spreading from block to block, the screaming of wounded civilians, and the frantic bells of emergency services, trying to respond to simultaneous disasters across the entire city. The most psychologically devastating raids were those that continued for hours. The London Blitz's longest single raid lasted over 8 hours, creating a sustained assault on human sanity that pushed civilian morale to its absolute breaking point. During these extended raids, the sound never stopped. It only varied in intensity and character as different waves of bombers arrived and departed. By the war's end, strategic bombing had killed over 400,000 German civilians and 60,000 British civilians, but the psychological casualties were immeasurable. Entire generations grew up understanding that the sound of aircraft engines could mean death from above, a psychological scar that lasted long after the last bomb had fallen. These 7 sounds represent more than just the audio signatures of weapons and warfare. They represent humanity's capacity to weaponize fear itself. Each sound was carefully engineered or naturally evolved to break the human spirit before the first shot was fired. World War II transformed sound from mere noise into psychological weaponry. The engineers and tacticians who designed these weapons understood something fundamental about human nature, that fear of the unknown and the anticipation of death could be as powerful as the weapons themselves. The survivors of these sounds carried their psychological imprints for the rest of their lives. Veterans would flinch at the sound of aircraft engines, the grinding of heavy machinery, or even the distant wail of sirens decades after the war ended. The sounds became permanently embedded in their memory as harbingers of death and destruction. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember that these sounds once filled the skies and battlefields of our world. They remind us that war is not just about tactics and strategy. It's about the human cost of conflict, measured not just in lives lost, but in psychological wounds that never fully heal. If this journey through the sonic landscape of World War II has captivated you, please subscribe to Diary of World War II and give this video a thumbs up. Share your thoughts about these terrifying sounds in the comments below, and let me know which sound you found most disturbing. Until next time, remember the stories of those who faced these sounds and lived to tell their tales.